Well, we thought about calling today's episode Dodgy Data, but we settled on questionable oilfield data. Or is it? Now today we're going to home in and we're going to look at California. So we haven't done any videos on the lower 48 US fields. We've done some mentions of Gulf of Mexico, but California is possibly not on the top of folks' lists of major oil producing US states. So we were inspired by a recent article that we saw on LinkedIn. It was by CNC Reservoirs. So we're going to be concentrating on the Midway Sunset oil field, and here's its location. It's about 30 miles southwest of Bakersfield and 90 miles northwest of Los Angeles. Now the field is about 25 miles long and 3 to 4 miles wide. Now here's a section from that post, and it features the San Joaquin Basin. Now the red arrow you see here is actually pointing out the San Andreas Fault, a major tectonic setting. It's a transpressional right lateral fault, major feature, well known I think by everybody. And some 10 miles away, here's the Midway Sunset Field, quite close by. The reservoir, it's mainly a Monterey Formation, Upper Miocene aged in the tertiary, but there are younger reservoirs as well. And you can see the structure here. It looks a bit different. So here's the life of field production profile for the Midway Sunset Field. It sort of kicked off here in around about 1900, started production here. Oil peaked to around about 93,000 barrels of oil back in 1914, and then there was a period of steady decline here, which at that time it looked like the field was going to achieve around about 1 billion barrels of ultimate recoverable. From sort of 1920 through to 1960, the oil rate was fairly steady, and then it sort of had a sustained and steady increase from 1960 through to 1990, where it then plateaued at about 165,000 barrels a day in this zone here, around about 1990 to 2000. Since then there's been a rapid decline in the oil rate, and it's been very steady over the next 20 years. It's noticeable that the gas rate doesn't mimic the oil rate. So what's going on here? And you can see with the water cut, well, we didn't have data before about 1920, but thereafter there's been a steady rise in water cut, and about 90% of the production is now water. The gas here you can see has gone up of late. Not entirely sure why this is. Is it because we're below the bubble point? Has the pressure dropped, or is there something else going on here? Well, we don't actually know from this graph. Worth investigating. Now the Midway Sunset Field has been operating under a cyclic steam flood for quite some time. You can see in this diagram here. Here the red lines are the vertical producers, and also we have these horizontal wells. Now the horizontal wells are around about 50 foot above the initial oil-water contact, but there are various contacts throughout the field here. We'll see more of the geology in a minute. You can see that the vertical wells, TD, it's about 100 feet above the initial oil-water contact. There's no information whether that contact has actually moved in time. You can see there are some very steeply dipping zones. Here you see the injection, which would be high in these vertical wells. So the steam would be injected in here, and then we'd have basically some gravity segregation or gravity drainage. The oil bank is kind of moving down towards the horizontal producers at the bottom. The steam actually soaks into these upper levels, and it migrates downwards due to that gravity drainage. Lower perforations in these vertical wells are also open, and so they also produce some of the oil. We always quality control our databases, and we were looking to see if we'd captured the data correctly for this field. When we saw that there was an average porosity of 58%, well, my reaction, heads are going to roll. That can't be right. And it can't be right because online you'll find from Dr. Paul Glover at my alma mater, University of Leeds, this is a sort of theoretical maximum that you can get, and with various packings of grain sizes. And indeed, if you get the cubic packing, you can get a maximum of 47.64%. So that's the theory. Also, we looked at the recovery factor. That's a very high, 79% recovery factor that we have quoted for this field. It may be okay for a high-performing gas field, but this is actually a heavy oil. Very strange. Somebody's definitely in trouble here. We actually did the checks and corroborated the values that we had in, and we thought, this is interesting. It's time for a Trove News video. And so we rehired everybody that we'd fired. Here is our trove entry for Midway Sunset. You can see we've got a huge amount of data in here, all sorts of information, maps, cross-sections, write-ups, published papers, abstracts, some historic material, some photographs showing the operation, and we've used some of this material in making the video today. You can see there is the entry from the CNC reservoirs from LinkedIn. We've actually included that within the trove entry. Now, a bit of background. So Midway Sunset was discovered back in 1894, about 125 years of production. Not bad. One of the largest oil-in-place oil fields in the United States. 4.4 billion barrels of oil is quoted as the resource size. It is highly complex, and we'll look into that in a bit more detail in the next few slides. Hundreds of pools. There's different trapping mechanisms and a lot of compartmentalization. The principal reservoir is Miocene-aged Monterey Formation, and that's a very interesting lithology, as we will see. And the API gravity, we've seen numbers in the range 12 to 21, hence within Trove we've quoted an average of 16.5, so that seems okay. Viscosity ranges from 11 to 7,000 centipoise, and that's at reservoir conditions. After the decline period in the 1940s and 50s, water injection commenced. In the 1960s, the companies involved moved on to thermal recovery techniques. Initially, that was in situ combustion, which went on all the way to 1992. And then from 1963 onwards, they started cyclic steam stimulation. I guess this is steam-assisted gas drainage. SAGD, or steam flooding, is another term for it. Now, some of the beds on the flanks, they're at 50 to 70 degree dip in some of these very tight folds, and that really does aid gravity drainage, and that goes some way to explain the high recovery factor. If we look at the reservoir, we sort of say, well, what are the lithologies? It might be easy to say, well, what aren't the lithologies? You can see quite a mix in this list, and here's some detail. You can see that lots of depositional facies, depositional processes. The porosity ranges are absolutely amazing, and you can see that we've got numbers up to sort of 65% porosity. That's in these pelagic to hemipelagic bioturbated mudstones. They are diatomaceous, and we'll see what that means in just a second. The oil saturation can be sometimes as high as 76%, but generally is rather low. The air PAM's very variable, but can go up to some very, very significant numbers. The reason that we can get porosities beyond 48% is because we're not actually looking at sort of solid billiard balls that we pack, as seen in experiments. In fact, if you look a little closer, these are these diatoms here, and you can see that some of them are actually partly hollow. The oil can actually migrate into these small microfossils, and basically we get this microporosity. The porosity can indeed be beyond 48%, and that's the explanation why we have 58% in the Trove database. It's probably a number that's difficult to actually decide, well, what is the average? But hey, it would highlight this is one to look at. This is anomalous. Why is it so high? And now you know. So within the San Joaquin Basin, in the margin, there's been a series of northwest-southeast trending anticlinal folds which have been modified by the San Andreas transpressional and wrenching fault movement. Now, the sandstones, they were deposited in the intervening synclines between these anticlinal folds. The sands thin out or pinch out over the anticlinal crests. In the late Miocene, there was uplift and some erosion, and in the Pliocene, well, we've had transgressions and erosive events, and indeed, we've got sands, oil-bearing sands in that zone, but we try and simplify things, and here is our simple explanation of the major reservoir, which, of course, is this late Miocene deep water submarine fan, which is full of sandstone, or largely sandstone, and it's encased in the shale. These sands are actually probably delivered by seismically induced landslides, debris flows, and turbidite flows. Now, the diatomaceous mudstone, that is quite amazing. It acts as the source rock, one of the major sources of the oil in California. There is a fractured reservoir in places, and in places it's actually the seal, depending really on the depth of burial controls. And the reason for that, during diagenesis, we go from a sort of an opal A diatomite in shallow depths through to a porcelainite, which is an opal CT around about 2,000 feet, and then again changing to sort of pure quartz chert at around about 5,600 feet. Now that's the local lithostratigraphic nomenclature, just there for reference. Now, have a look at the diatomites, and here you can see a sample of it, all just made up of these microfossils, tiny, tiny grains. And basically, it's just a mudstone, or it compacts to a shale. They can be very, very thick, up to 400 feet, very high porosity. The permeability is generally very poor, less than 5 millidarcies, but it's highly compressible. As the production depletes the fluids, it lowers the pressure. It actually leads to compaction and subsidence. There can be very high oil saturations, 30, 95% in some of the producible intervals. These are probably in the more permeable and porous sands. But as you can see within the mudstones, sometimes we don't get particularly high oil saturations. Now, it's highly faulted and fractured, greater deformation near some of the faults, and overturned and faulted fells are very, very common. The oil quoted here, 13 API, and I guess this is the sort of the benchmark that's quoted for a Midway Sunset, but we'll see more about the API gravity in a slide or two. Produces from fractures, both natural and induced fractures, so actually fracking the formations here to actually improve productivity. Now, the high permeability zones, which are often zones that are filled with bitumen, they, once depleted of the oil, can actually serve as thief zones for the injected steam. Sometimes the steam's not actually going where it's needed or wanted because it's actually taken away. Here's a schematic here showing all the faults and the offsets, and we'll have a look at some cross sections. You see, it's a very, very complicated field. Lots and lots of different pools, lots of different compartments, lots of different oil-water contexts. And this is the sort of sedimentary model here. So you can see here's the San Andreas Fault moving laterally. Then on the other side of it, we have this range of mountains here, which are the source of the sands that actually come across and possibly triggered by earthquake movements along the San Andreas. And we get these submarine fans here that fall into the basin, into the lows, but also we have these diatom blooms, and of course the whole thing gets shaken up and moved around, and we get the two facies mixing in. Now, let's have a look at a result of that high compressibility. You do see at surface, sometimes you see these sinkholes and these steam vents. It's probably just as well this is a semi-arid area and there really isn't much land use. Nothing that the land could be used for, but there will be some legacy issues with this field. Possibly a lot of this may be down to the in situ combustion phase, because that really can't be controlled quite as well as water injection, or for that matter steam injection, which is perhaps a less aggressive way of trying to recover oil. In this old cross-section, we can see the primary or the main reservoir here, the oil accumulated here in this asymmetric anticlinal feature. Very flat limb here and very steep on the east side. And then above it, you can see this thick diatomaceous unit. Now, here's the sea level here, and so ground level about 1,300 feet. You can see that the main oil reservoir here, that's at around about 1,000 to 1,500 feet subsea. You can see also unconformities, erosive sections, and then you see these Pliocene sands here actually pinching out onto the high. We also get within this sort of Pleistocene section, we do get pools of oil, which tend to be heavier and biodegraded in places. But what we see in a more modern section, here's the main pool here, and it's called the Spellacy Sands, and you can see different oil-water contacts, some gas pools. We have lateral pinch-outs of units within here, some of these submarine fans. But we have older accumulations, and here down in the Republic, we've got gas and an oil leg. And we also have these shallower units. In fact, there are these thin pools, small pools within the Talar Formation, which I think is getting on to as young as Pleistocene in places. Having a look at the structure, and this comes from Eddie Ong, and you can see a number of cross-sections here. Now, we have lots and lots of different cross-sections within our Trove database. The morphology and the shape of the field is changing as we go along the length of it. Here's another section here. It's this line A prime here, running from the southwest up to the northeast. Here's the San Andreas Fault. These are the main producing horizons. Can see the ages Pleistocene to Pliocene, and then we get down into the Miocene here, and it's all of this sequence here that's referred to as the Monterey Formation. But anyway, that's giving a flavour, and it is quite unusual for a structure of an oil field to look quite like this, but it is an unusual setting. So we can actually break down and look at the individual sands and their deposition and distribution. So here, in terms of surface expression, here's a picture of the oil field back in 1908, and here's a more modern picture. It's not the prettiest sight to see. It's kind of not much use for this land. It's, as you can see, is quite arid. So to get some idea of the scale, how many wells are there in Midway Sunset? Well, for a lot of the people watching this channel, they may be involved in offshore developments, in deep water subsea developments. And some would say that, well, you know, a field with one well or maybe up to a few hundred wells, that would be typical, even in giant or supergiant fields. Well, in the case of Midway Sunset, there are over 11,000 producing wells in the field. Now, we spoke about the oil quality at Midway Sunset, and you can see in this analysis here, broken out as a lighter oil here, 21 degrees API, and heavy oil, somewhere between 12 and 14 degree API. Now, in the upper sands, these are where there's sort of hydraulic fracturing, and water flood has been a very successful recovery mechanism. But you can see in this heavier oil, it's actually the cyclic steam injection or steam flood that's actually helped to produce the oil in here. These aren't the only numbers that you can find if you look around. There's a range. Now, we've quoted 16.5 as sort of middle of that sort of range. There are very, very different numbers around. You can see here we've got 14.3 to 16.1 to anything between 11 up to 32 as a range. We can see in here 8 to 32, and we can see here 13 and in some cases below 11. So quite a number of different values quoted, and that's what we find a lot when we compile the data for Trove. And in the case of Midway Sunset, some of the lighter crudes were produced in the early days, and some of the lower API crudes, which are a lot more viscous, they've really only started being produced once that the steam injections come in, and we'll talk about the mechanisms for why that is in just a minute. So like this picture here, it comes from the New York Times. That looks fairly gloopy looking oil. Now here is the thermal enhanced oil recovery using steam. We generate steam, we inject it down these wells, and we get what's called this steam chest, and it moves laterally, it soaks over time, and then it actually makes the oil less viscous, perhaps less dense, and so under the aid of gravity, it starts to sink down, and we tend to actually start then to produce it from some of the deeper perforations we get in some of the production wells, and indeed some of the horizontal wells that we saw earlier. Pause the video to read the details. Now, when we look at the recovery components, well, it's all about permeability enhancement. And again, pause the video if you want to study this. It's partly viscosity reduction, some compaction effects, and then regulate the pressure drawdown in specific wells. If we look at some of the emissions data, the greenhouse gas emissions from Midway Sunset are actually quite high, and they're up there with the likes of the Canadian tar sands. Now, on this graph here, you can see very, very high up in the range. Now, there are some assets in different countries and different areas that are higher, but there's a lot that are a lot lower. This graph shows the total greenhouse gas emissions, and it's broken out by the upstream emissions, the midstream emissions, and the downstream emissions. Upstream is basically what you do to produce it. Midstream is kind of refining and perhaps transportation. And downstream are the emissions for what it's used for, and that could be putting in cars or powering oil-fired plants or whatever it might be. So you can see that by far and away the biggest contribution is from the downstream. So it's actually the consumers that are culpable for this, not the producers. Around about 180 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per barrel of crude. It is quite high, and over time this actually will go up, because the steam injection actually is energy intensive, and so it actually generates some emissions itself. So it could go up to of the order of 200 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel of crude. By far and away, the major contribution is actually the emissions on the downstream side, the actual using of it. I did find this during our research, and it's quite a useful calculator, which converter. So it's at the climateaccountability.org. And this can be used to actually convert between various energy units and various metrics that are used for actually measuring carbon and other emissions. Were we correct with our Trove entries? Well, we had 79% recovery factor, and if we look at the data in here, well, the ultimate recoverable reserves are around about 3.5 billion barrels out of a STOIIP of 4,400. Now, very often we see ranges quoted. Here it's so complicated. This is the number that we will put in carry for the field, but I'm sure that's a very, very complicated estimation and calculation that's been done to come up with that number. But using those two figures, and you can see, well, 79% is the ultimate recoverable factor. Well, to 2021, we've produced 3.2 billion barrels. I mean, it does look that we're going to get all the way up over time. We'll get up to that 79% ultimate recovery. So the recovery factor does look to be right. What about the porosity? Well, we had 58% in here. And as we saw earlier, there's quite a range we can see here from the sandy debris, the turbidites, all the way through to the pelagic and hemipelagic mudstones. And we get anything between very, very low, sort of nearly 0% porosity, all the way up to 65% porosity. Well, our average of 58, I guess it's going to flag to anybody. This is unusual. This is anomalous. This is worth having a look at. That's why we've done the video today. And finally, I think we've seen with API gravity, bit of a mess. There's numbers all over the place, but 16.5 degree API, that kind of points out it's a heavy crude. Yes, there are going to be some issues, but there is a wide range on that. In summary, Trove, it's always growing, so the sooner you subscribe, the better value, because you can lock in the price for a few years and still benefit from all the updates that we keep putting out quarterly to all our subscribers. We fill it in with all the key news and data from around the world. It's a great way of staying up to date with all the news and all the developments over a period of time. So if you want to become a subscriber, just send us an email at that address. We are offering a 3-month trial of Trove. It's your opportunity to just see how data rich it is and how useful it can be to your operation. So send us an email. Thank you for watching today. Subscribe, give us a thumbs up, ring the bell. You know what to do. Hope to see you back on the channel before too long. Bye for now.